Imagine that you were able to hop into a time machine and go back to the very first academy in ancient Greece, thousands of years ago, where the very first institution of higher education was established. If you happen to be one of the few elite men that were granted entry into the institution, you would notice some astounding differences, like there's no electricity. But there's one significant similarity, and that is that students would be studying and practicing the art of persuasion in the public sphere. Argumentation and debate is one of the oldest subjects studied in higher education, and this history has generated some of the most useful tools. Alright, now imagine that you sat through these classes and you were able to watch students. Students must have experimented with a bunch of different approaches and discussed the results. They would talk about which tactics work best and with regularity. It wouldn't take long for anyone to recognize certain patterns in debate. Scholars of ancient rhetorical studies explain that ancient students were able to identify recurring arguments, and that those recurring arguments are what we now call stock issues. So in this video, we're going to cover the common stock issues in contemporary debate, with the exception of criterion, which is covered in another seminar. First, we will explore some background information on stock issues, then cover the stock issues for policy debates, and finally discuss stock issues you might find in value debates. Let's start with what stock issues are not. They are not, as some people treat them, absolute rules about how to organize cases. The concept of stock issues means different things in different debates. The two most common forms of debate are policy and value. But regardless of what type of debate you participate in, you are going to experience what Aristotle called stasis. Stasis is the rest or halt which occurs between opposing arguments. It is likely that you are already personally familiar with this phenomenon. Think to the last time that you were asked what you wanted to eat, or what you wanted to do over the weekend. Did you spit out an immediate response? You probably took a little bit of time to weigh your options. Well, this happens several times in debates. But not only that. These moments of stasis often revolve around similar issues regardless of the topic. For instance, what to eat and what to do both require contemplating how much each option costs and the time involved. Therefore, time and money would be issues common to both questions. Common questions are the foundation of stock issues. In fact, the most inclusive definition of stock issues is that they are the questions which occur with frequency in the course of argumentation. Luckily, people have been having structured debates long enough to record the common questions in debate and have noticed some pretty clear patterns that you would benefit from knowing. For instance, one common question that arises in many debates, if not all of them, is how do we determine which arguments win the debate? This question is at the root of the criterion stock issue. But beyond this similar stock issue, the patterns are different for policy cases and value cases. So let's take a look at each one. For policy cases, there are three stock issues that are unique to this type of argumentation. Debaters generally recognize that the first stock issue is called harms. What are harms when we talk about stock issues? Okay, imagine again that you are in that ancient academy in Athens, where a type of question/answer approach dominates learning. This is like the Socratic method of learning. If someone stands up and makes a proposal, let's say to levy a tax on citizens, what do you think the most common questions an opponent would have for the speaker? I think it is safe to say that one common question would be, what's the problem? In fact, that question is asked so often that it would be smart to just assume that your opponent is going to ask the question and therefore include your answer in the first speech, right? Well, that line of reasoning establishes our first stock issue. The harm stock issue is an argument or set of arguments that attempts to persuade an audience that there are problems with the status quo. Status quo refers to the current state of affairs. I like to think of it as status now, just because it helps me to remember. There are a couple of ways to show harms in the status quo, and a good debater employs the use of both tactics. Those tactics are qualitative harms and quantitative harms. Qualitative harms are based on data of particular people and events. They go into detail about the individuals that are currently suffering hardships, whereas quantitative harms rely on statistical data to articulate the extent of human suffering. Both are compelling to audiences and should be used during the construction and delivery of your affirmative case. For instance, let's say I wanted to articulate the harms of global warming. I could talk about how many inches oceans are set to rise because of melting ice caps, and that is a compelling story, but including information about specific cultures that live on low-lying islands and how they could be wiped out is also compelling to audiences. The first piece of data is quantitative and the second is qualitative, but when they are used together, they create a narrative that is greater than the sum of its parts. Okay, so one of the common questions of an affirmative proposal is, what's the problem? So what's another question? Can you think of another? You might be asking, is there a solution? But before that question, there is a prior question that one ought to ask, and that is, what is causing the problem? This question establishes the stock issue of inherency. The inherency stock issue is an argument or set of arguments that argue that the problem will persist if no action is taken. I like to think of inherency in terms of the phrase, the harms aren't going to fix themselves. There are two types of inherency, structural and attitudinal. Structural inherency argues that there is a law or policy that is creating the harms. For the global warming case, an argument could be made that the subsidies that are given to companies for fossil fuel extraction and that the use of those fossil fuels contribute to global warming because of carbon emissions. Attitudinal inherency is a type of inherency that argues that there is a common behavior or attitude that perpetuates the harms. So, for the global warming case, one could argue that people generally prefer fossil fuel sources of energy because it is cheaper and more reliable. I would suggest having one focused, well-researched inherency story. Exploring every single cause to the problem begins to imply that your plan will address all of them, which is an unnecessary burden to take on. To firmly establish inherency, do it with depth rather than breadth. What I mean is, if my plan were to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, I would focus on the structural inherency of subsidies and only subsidies. Talk about the history. Give figures, how significant the subsidies are. But there is no need to go into the popular attitude towards fossil fuel because your case doesn't deal with that issue. Remember, you are not obligated to fix all of the world's problems, only to make the world better than the status quo. Inherency is your chance to focus your case on the one thing that can be fixed. For the final stock issue for policy cases, we can ask why the proposal will solve the problems. This question gives rise to the solvency stock issue. Solvency is an argument or set of arguments that the proposed plan will solve the harms. While this sounds easy, some debaters take this stock issue for granted, as if identifying harms and inherency is all you need in order to justify a plan. But many plans with the best of intentions fail. In fact, solvency arguments are one of the most popular on-case arguments in debates. So, put some energy into this stock issue. There are a couple of things that an affirmative can do to craft a good solvency argument. First, you want to make sure that the solvency links to the plan. The link story should explain how the plan creates a series of effects. For instance, eliminating fossil fuel subsidies will cause companies to find ways to supplant that lost revenue, and they will seek renewable energy subsidies. Notice that your plan does not force the companies to seek renewable energy subsidies, but you can still argue that such behavior is likely if this plan were to pass. You might think that this logic is debatable, and you're right, it is. The second thing that affirmative debates can do to craft a good solvency argument is include significant impacts. In other words, there should be an explanation that you solve for a significant amount of your harms. You might ask, What is significant? That's a good question without a good answer. What is or is not significant is debatable and is something that is often disputed in the debate itself. My only piece of advice is to defend as much solvency as your research supports and no more. Do not make empty promises of a utopian future. Those tend to bite you later in the debate. Use your judgment and argue for reasonably significant impacts. The stock issues for policy cases do not automatically translate into value cases, so debaters need to follow a different pattern. Furthermore, the stock issues for value debates are not as well established as stock issues for policy debates, so they are a little more abstract. Other than criterion, there are two stock issues for value cases, and the first is the value justification. A value justification simply means that the affirmative side warrants the value criterion in the debate. Remember, stock issues are derived from recurring questions. So one question that commonly arises in value rounds is, in what ways does the affirmative meet the value? For example, if the resolution is that nuclear energy is better than renewable energy, and the affirmative has argued in favor of a value criterion of quality of life, then any argument that nuclear energy improves the quality of life meets the value justification stock issue. These arguments can include how nuclear energy provides a stable source of energy for things like medical institutions and heating during cold seasons. For the same resolution, but a value criterion of security, typical arguments that meet the value criterion would be about how nuclear submarines are effective at repelling hostile attacks. The second stock issue in value debates is the value objection. This stock issue answers the question, in what ways does the negative side fail to meet the value? In this stock issue, the affirmative can debunk arguments that the negative might bring up against the affirmative, and show how the negative does not warrant the value criterion. Remember, you want to filter everything through whatever the value criterion is. For the nuclear energy resolution, for example, if the value is quality of life, the affirmative could explain the unreliability and environmental harm of renewable energy. If the value is security, the affirmative could argue that there are currently no ways to power sophisticated naval vessels with renewable energy. Each of these arguments, of course, require research and evidence for support, but you can see how stock issues helps you to frame the arguments you are going to develop even without evidence. There are more stock issues that correlate with other debates in science, history, and other fields that are outside the scope of this video, but at least you know two most common sets of stock issues in order to help you plan a general strategy for most debate topics. Following stock issues is more than just abiding by debate rules. You are following a very long tradition in the study of argumentation and debate. You are answering common questions before they are even asked. You are covering as many bases as possible before your opponent gets up to speak. I'm pretty sure that if you were able to witness the first classes in the academy at Athens, and if we were able to speak ancient Greek, we might see some significant similarities between our respective times. One of those similarities would be the use of stock issues to compose affirmative speeches. Check out the video on criterion to understand some of the references made in this video.